The day her father sold her, he told himself it was an act of survival, the kind of decision a desperate man makes when the walls close in and every other door has already been shut. He didn't raise his voice when he said it, didn't try to dress it up with comforting words or empty promises. He just stood there in that dim kitchen, the same one where she had grown up, and spoke as if the outcome had already been decided long before either of them said a word. She was 19 years old, old enough to understand what was happening but still young enough to believe there might be some mistake, some last-minute change that would stop everything from unfolding. But there wasn't. And when the man arrived calm and composed, carrying nothing but a quiet authority that seemed settle over the entire house, the reality of it all became impossible to ignore. The man who bought her wasn't just wealthy. He was something else entirely, someone whose influence stretched into places she couldn't see, whose intentions were never explained, only assumed. And as she stood there listening to numbers exchanged like they were nothing more than routine, she realized that whatever came next would follow her for the rest of her life. But what happened next, no one, not even the man who made the deal, could have predicted. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why would a father look at his own daughter, someone he had raised, protected, and once promised to never let harm come near, and decide that the only way forward was to hand her over to a man whose world operated far beyond anything she understood? That question didn't begin on the day Emily Carter was taken from that small Kentucky home. It had been building quietly for months, maybe even years, shaped by unpaid debts, sleepless nights, and a kind of pressure that doesn't show itself all at once but settles in slowly until it becomes impossible to ignore. And yet, even with all of that, there is always a line people believe they will never cross. For her father, that line moved inch by inch until the moment came when it no longer existed. But that only explains part of the story, because the second question is just as important and far more unsettling. Who exactly was Daniel Hayes? To the outside world, he was a billionaire with investments spread across industries most people never think about, a man who rarely gave interviews and whose name appeared in headlines without ever revealing much about the person behind it. Some described him as disciplined, others as distant, and a few who claimed to know him better spoke carefully, choosing their words in ways that suggested there was more they weren't saying. There were no clear answers, only impressions, and none of them prepared Emily for what she would find once she stepped into his world. Because the truth is, stories like this don't follow a simple path. When someone is taken from everything they know and placed into a life defined by wealth, power, and control, the expectation is clear. People assume they understand how it ends before it even begins. They imagine confinement, obedience, a slow loss of identity, and for a time, Emily believed that too. Every mile she traveled away from home reinforced that belief. Every quiet moment inside that unfamiliar house made it harder to hold on to anything that felt certain. But then something changed. Not all at once, and not in a way that could be easily explained, but enough to raise a third question, one that no one had considered when the deal was made. How does a story that begins with loss, with a transaction that reduces a person to a number, end with something entirely different? How does someone taken under those circumstances become something no one expected? That question didn't have an immediate answer, and that's what makes what follows so difficult to understand. Because the deeper Emily moved into Daniel Hayes's world, the less it resembled what anyone, including her, had prepared for. Emily Carter hadn't always lived in survival mode, but by the time she turned 19, it was the only version of life she really understood. The house she grew up in sat just outside a small Kentucky town where everyone knew each other's names but rarely knew the full story behind closed doors. From the outside, her life looked simple, even ordinary, but inside, things had been slowly unraveling for years. After her mother passed away, the weight of holding everything together fell almost entirely on her father. He had always been a hardworking man, the kind who believed that showing up every day and doing his job was enough to build a stable life. For a long time it was, but injuries from years of physical labor began to take their toll, and the jobs that once came easily started slipping away. What followed was an immediate collapse, but something quieter and more difficult to recognize at first. Bills started arriving faster than they could be paid. Repairs around the house were delayed, then ignored. And the man who had once carried himself with certainty began to move through his days with a kind of quiet tension that Emily noticed even when he tried to hide it. Emily stepped in without being asked. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, worked weekends, and handed over nearly everything she earned without hesitation. She didn't see it as sacrifice. To her, it was simply what needed to be done. That sense of responsibility defined her in ways that others often admired but didn't fully understand. She rarely complained, rarely questioned, and almost never allowed herself to think about what she might have wanted if things had been different. There were moments, brief ones, where she imagined a future beyond the town she had grown up in, but those thoughts never stayed long. Reality had a way of pulling her back quickly. Still, despite everything, she held onto a quiet kind of hope, not the loud, optimistic kind people talk about, but something steadier. A belief that if she kept going, if she kept doing what was right, things might eventually change. Her father saw all of this, even when he didn't say it out loud. And that's what made his situation even more complicated. He wasn't blind to her effort or her loyalty. In fact, it weighed on him heavily. Every unpaid bill, every call from a creditor, every reminder of what he couldn't provide anymore added to a growing sense of failure that he carried with him daily. Pride kept him from asking for help, and fear kept him from admitting how serious things had become. There were nights he stayed awake long after Emily had gone to bed, sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at numbers that no longer added up. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about time running out. Medical issues he hadn't fully disclosed, debts that had begun to attract the attention of people who didn't offer second chances, and a reality that was closing in faster than he could manage. When the opportunity first appeared, it didn't come in a way that immediately revealed its full weight. It was introduced carefully, almost casually, through someone who understood exactly how to present it. A solution disguised as an option. A way out that didn't require public failure or visible collapse. At first, he dismissed it. The idea itself went against everything he believed about himself, about fatherhood, about the kind of man he thought he was. But the more he considered his situation, the more that line he once thought was unmovable began to shift. Not all at once, but gradually, in small, quiet moments where desperation replaced certainty. He told himself it wasn't what it sounded like. He convinced himself there were details he didn't fully understand yet, that maybe it wouldn't be as final as it seemed. And in those thoughts, he found just enough justification to keep listening. Emily wasn't part of those conversations. She didn't hear the discussions, didn't see the hesitation, didn't witness the internal struggle that played out long before the final decision was made. To her, everything appeared the same on the surface, even as the foundation beneath it was changing. That's what made what happened next feel so sudden, even though it had been building for far longer than she realized. By the time her father sat across from Daniel Hayes and agreed to terms that could never truly be undone, the decision had already been made in his mind. He didn't see it as giving up. He saw it as the only remaining way to protect what little they had left, even if it meant losing something far more important in the process. And then a deal was offered that would change everything. Daniel Hayes was not a man people easily understood, and that was by design. His name appeared in financial publications, attached to billion-dollar deals and companies that shaped industries most people never thought twice about. But beyond those headlines, there was very little. No interviews explaining his philosophy, no public displays of wealth meant to impress, no personal scandals that could be easily confirmed or denied. What existed instead were fragments, stories passed between people who claimed to have crossed paths with him, each one slightly different, each one incomplete. Some described him as disciplined to a fault, a man who valued structure and control above everything else. Others hinted at a past that had shaped him in ways he never spoke about, something that explained the distance he maintained from the world around him. And then there were those who avoided the subject entirely, choosing silence over speculation, as if even discussing him carried a kind of risk they weren't willing to take. When Emily Carter first saw him standing in her home, none of those stories mattered. All she saw was a man who didn't belong there, someone whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the room without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture. He spoke calmly, directly, never wasting words. When he addressed her father, it wasn't with authority or pressure, but with a kind of certainty that suggested the outcome had already been decided. The conversation that followed was brief, almost unsettling in its simplicity. There were no negotiations in the way Emily would have expected, no back and forth that might suggest hesitation. Instead, there was an understanding between two men who approached the situation from entirely different positions but arrived at the same conclusion. The arrangement itself was never explained to Emily in full, not in that moment. What she heard were fragments, terms that felt incomplete, details that raised more questions than they answered. There was mention of opportunity, of structure, of a future that would look very different from the one she had known. But there were also conditions, expectations that were outlined in a way that made it clear this was not a simple transition from one life to another. It was something more controlled, more defined, something that required her to step into a role she didn't yet understand. And as she stood there, listening without interruption, she felt the weight of a decision being made around her rather than with her. The silence in the room carried more meaning than anything that was said. Her father's hands rested on the table unmoving, his eyes fixed somewhere just beyond her, as if looking directly at her would make the moment impossible to follow through. Daniel Hayes remained composed, observing, waiting, allowing the space for the final step to happen without forcing it. And when the papers were placed on the table, the reality of the situation became undeniable. This was no longer a conversation. It was an agreement, one that required a signature, a moment that would separate everything that came before from everything that would follow. Emily's internal conflict didn't show on the surface. but it was there, building quietly as she processed what little she understood. She could have asked questions, could have to another. It was something more controlled, more defined, something that required her to step into a role she didn't yet understand. And as she stood there, listening without interruption, she felt the weight of a decision being made around her rather than with her. The silence in the room carried more meaning than anything that was said. Her father's hands rested on the table unmoving, his eyes fixed somewhere just beyond her, as if looking directly at her would make the moment impossible to follow through. Daniel Hayes remained composed, observing, waiting, allowing the space for the final step to happen without forcing it. And when the papers were placed on the table, the reality of the situation became undeniable. This was no longer a conversation. It was an agreement, one that required a signature, a moment that would separate everything that came before from everything that would follow. Emily's internal conflict didn't show on the surface, but it was there, building quietly as she processed what little she understood. She could have asked questions, could have demanded clarity, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way her father avoided her gaze, or the realization that whatever answers she might receive wouldn't change what was already happening. So she stayed silent, watching as the pen moved across the paper, as the final step was completed with a steadiness that didn't reflect the gravity of the decision. And just like that, it was done. No dramatic conclusion, no moment of acknowledgement, just a quiet shift in reality that left her standing on one side of a line she hadn't chosen to cross. She thought she understood the deal, but she had no idea what she had just agreed to. The transition from everything Emily Carter had known to the world Daniel Hayes lived in didn't happen gradually. It was immediate, almost disorienting in the way it replaced one reality with another without giving her time to process the distance between them. The small, worn-down house in Kentucky, with its creaking floors and quiet reminders of struggle, was gone in a matter of hours, replaced by a place that felt carefully constructed to eliminate any trace of disorder. The home she arrived at wasn't just large, it was precise. Every room seemed arranged with intention, every object placed exactly where it was meant to be, as if nothing was left to chance. It wasn't the kind of luxury that tried to impress. It was the kind that assumed it didn't need to. At first, Emily expected to feel overwhelmed by it, but what she noticed instead was something else entirely. The silence. It wasn't the comforting kind she had grown used to in quiet moments back home. This was different, controlled, almost deliberate, as if the absence of noise was part of the structure itself. There were people in the house, staff who moved efficiently and spoke politely, but even their presence didn't disrupt the stillness. Everything operated smoothly, without friction, without unpredictability. And that, more than anything, unsettled her, because it made her aware of just how little she understood about the environment she had entered. Power imbalance between her and Daniel Hayes was obvious, but it wasn't expressed in the ways she had prepared herself for. He didn't issue commands or enforce his authority through intimidation. Instead, he maintained a distance that felt even more difficult to navigate. When he spoke, it was measured, purposeful, never raising his voice, never showing frustration. He asked questions, but only the ones he chose to ask, and he listened in a way that suggested he was always evaluating, always observing. It created a kind of tension that didn't rely on fear alone but on uncertainty. Because without clear boundaries or visible rules, she was left to interpret everything on her own. What confused her even more were the moments that didn't fit the expectations she had built in her mind. There were small gestures, subtle ones, that didn't align with the idea of someone who had just taken control of her life. He made sure she had access to things she had never been able to afford before, arranged for her to continue her education, and spoke about her future in terms that suggested possibility rather than limitation. But those gestures were always controlled, always framed within a structure she didn't fully understand. It wasn't kindness in the way she had experienced it before. It felt intentional, almost strategic, as if each decision served a purpose beyond what was immediately visible. That uncertainty stayed with her as the days passed. She found herself watching him closely, trying to understand what he wanted, what he expected, what role she was meant to play in a life that didn't feel like her own. There were moments when she questioned whether she had misjudged everything, whether the situation was different from what she had feared, but those thoughts never settled into certainty, because no matter how calm the environment appeared, the foundation it was built on remained the same. She hadn't chosen to be there, and that fact shaped everything else that followed. Then one evening, after allowing her time to adjust without interference, Daniel Hayes finally addressed what she had been waiting to hear from the beginning. He didn't sit her down for a long explanation or offer reassurance. Instead, he handed her a document, much like the one her father had signed, but this one was different. It outlined expectations, guidelines, and boundaries that would define her life moving forward. As she read through it, line by line, she realized something that shifted her understanding of everything that had happened so far. The rules he gave her weren't what she expected. As the days turned into weeks, something began to shift between Emily Carter and Daniel Hayes, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. What had started as silence and distance slowly evolved into something more complex, a quiet exchange of observation and restraint where every interaction carried weight. Emily found herself paying closer attention, not just to what Daniel said, but to what he chose not to say. It was in those gaps that the real tension lived. He never treated her as if she were powerless, but he never let her forget the circumstances that brought her there either. That contradiction stayed with her, shaping the way she responded to him, the way she measured her words, and the way she began to question everything she thought she understood about her situation. There were moments when their conversations felt almost normal, if normal could exist in a place like that. He would ask about her classes, her progress, her thoughts on things that seemed unrelated to the arrangement that defined their connection. And at first she answered cautiously, unsure of what he was looking for. But over time something changed. She stopped trying to guess what he wanted to hear and started speaking more honestly, more directly. That shift didn't go unnoticed. Daniel listened differently when she did that, not as someone evaluating an asset, but as someone trying to understand a perspective he couldn't replicate on his own. And that realization unsettled her more than anything else because it didn't fit into the narrative she had built to protect herself. One evening, after a long stretch of quiet days, Emily decided to push past the uncertainty that had been building inside her since the beginning. She found him in the study, the same place he seemed to retreat to when he wanted distance from everything else. He didn't look surprised to see her, which told her he had expected this moment long before she had. She didn't hesitate this time. "You didn't answer my question," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Why me?" For a brief moment, there was no response. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, but there was a pause that hadn't been there before, a hesitation that suggested the answer carried more weight than he was willing to reveal casually. "You assume this was about you," he said finally, his tone measured, controlled. It was. The answer caught her off guard, not because it was vague, but because of how direct it was. "Then what was it about?" she asked, refusing to let the moment pass without clarity. Daniel studied her for a moment as if deciding how much to say, how much to hold back. "There are systems in place," he continued, "structures that repeat themselves over and over again. People don't notice them because they're too close to them. They accept them even when those systems work against them." Emily frowned slightly, trying to follow his meaning, but it only raised more questions. "And that has something to do with me?" she asked. "It has everything to do with why you're here," he replied. That was the moment the ground beneath her understanding began to shift. Because up until then, everything she had believed about the situation was built on a single assumption, that she had been taken, controlled, placed into someone else's life for reasons that served him alone. But the way Daniel spoke didn't align with that idea. It suggested something broader, something that extended beyond her, beyond him, into a space she hadn't considered. Over the following days, pieces of his past began to surface, not in a single explanation but in fragments. He spoke about where he came from, not with emotion but with clarity, a background that wasn't as distant from hers as she had imagined. Circumstances that forced decisions early shaped his understanding of power, of control, of what it meant to change the direction of a life that seemed predetermined. Emily listened, but she didn't accept everything at face value. If anything, it made her more cautious, more aware that there was a deeper layer to everything he said. Because no matter how he framed it, the reality of how she arrived there couldn't be separated from whatever justification he offered. And yet the more she observed, the more she noticed inconsistencies in her own assumptions. He wasn't restricting her growth, he was pushing it. He wasn't isolating her from opportunity. He was placing her directly in front of it, and that contradiction forced her to confront a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. By the time the truth fully revealed itself, it didn't come as a dramatic confession or a single defining moment. It came as a realization, built slowly from everything she had seen, everything she had experienced since the day she left her home. Daniel Hayes hadn't bought her for the reasons everyone would assume. He wasn't trying to control her, he was trying to change something far bigger. The shift didn't happen all at once, and that's what made it so difficult for Emily Carter to recognize at first. It wasn't announced, it wasn't defined, and it certainly wasn't explained. But somewhere between the structure Daniel Hayes had placed around her life and the opportunities he continued to present, something began to change. The same environment that once felt controlled and unfamiliar slowly started to feel navigable. Not comfortable, not entirely her own, but no longer something she moved through without influence. She began making choices, small at first, decisions about her studies, her schedule, the direction she wanted to take with the opportunities she had been given. And what stood out most was that Daniel didn't interfere. He observed just as he always had, but the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer reacting to his world. She was starting to shape her place within it. That change created a different kind of tension between them, one that wasn't rooted in uncertainty alone, but in something more complex. Trust, not the kind that forms easily or quickly, but the kind that builds in quiet moments, through consistency, through actions that align over time. Emily didn't fully trust him, not yet, but she also couldn't deny that his behavior hadn't followed the path she had feared from the beginning. And Daniel, in turn, began to engage with her differently. Their conversations became less guarded, more direct. He challenged her thinking, questioned her decisions, not to limit her but to push her further. It was a form of control, but not the kind she had expected. It wasn't about restricting her. It was about forcing her to confront her own limitations, the ones shaped by the life she had lived before she ever met him. "You're still thinking like someone who believes this is temporary," Daniel said to her one evening, his tone calm but pointed. They were sitting across from each other, the same controlled space, but the atmosphere between them had changed. "Isn't it?" Emily replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I didn't choose this." Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words without conceding anything else. "No," he said, "you didn't, but that doesn't change what you do with it now." The conversation stayed with her long after it ended, not because of what he said, but because of what it implied. That her identity, the version of herself she had carried for years, wasn't fixed. That it could evolve, even under circumstances she hadn't chosen. And it did. Gradually, almost without her realizing it, Emily began to see herself differently. Not as someone defined solely by what had happened to her, but as someone capable of influencing what came next. She started taking initiative, stepping into situations she would have avoided before, making decisions that carried real weight. And each time she did, Daniel allowed it. He didn't step in, didn't correct her, didn't impose his authority in the way she had once expected. Instead, he watched, letting the outcome unfold, as if the process itself mattered more than the result. But that didn't erase the past. It didn't change the way everything began, and that truth remained present, even as her role in his world evolved. Because no matter how much influence she gained, no matter how much her identity transformed, there was still a question that hadn't been fully answered. A question that had followed her from the very beginning, one that had only grown more complicated as everything else shifted around it. And then she discovered the truth about why he chose her. The answer didn't come easily, and when it did, it wasn't handed to Emily Carter in a way that offered comfort or closure. It came in pieces, through moments that forced her to connect details she had overlooked, conversations she had only half understood. And a silence from Daniel Hayes that now felt deliberate rather than distant. For weeks, she had sensed that there was something more beneath everything he had told her, something he had chosen not to reveal outright. And the closer she came to understanding it, the more she realized that whatever truth he was holding onto wasn't just about her. It was about him, about something that had shaped the way he saw the world long before she ever entered it. It began with a name she had never heard before, not spoken directly, not introduced as something important, but mentioned in passing during one of their conversations. Daniel didn't elaborate, didn't explain its significance, but the way he paused afterward was enough for Emily to notice. It was subtle, almost unrecognizable unless you were looking for it, but she was, and once she noticed it, she couldn't ignore it. That name became a thread she followed carefully, quietly, until it led her to something she hadn't expected to find. Old records, archived information, fragments of a past Daniel had never openly shared. And within those fragments, a pattern began to form. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, didn't come from him. It came from what he had left behind without realizing it. Years earlier, before the wealth, before the influence, before the life he now controlled so carefully, there had been someone else. A young woman whose circumstances mirrored Emily's in ways that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence. She had come from a similar background, faced similar limitations, carried the same kind of quiet determination to rise above it all. But her story hadn't ended the way Emily's was beginning to. It had ended abruptly, shaped by decisions Daniel had made when he was still learning what power meant and how it could be used. When Emily confronted him, she didn't hold back. The question she had carried for so long finally had context, and she needed to hear the answer from him, not from the pieces she had uncovered on her own. "You knew," she said, her voice steady but charged with everything she had been holding on to. "You saw it before I ever stepped into this house, that's why you chose me." Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't deflect or attempt to redirect the conversation. Instead, he did something he had avoided since the day they met. He told the truth. "She didn't get the chance you're getting," he said, his tone quieter than she had ever heard it. "And I didn't understand what that meant until it was too late." There was no attempt to justify it, no effort to soften the weight of what he was admitting. It was a statement of fact, delivered without emotion but carrying more of it than anything he had said before. Emily felt the impact of it immediately, not just because of what it revealed about him, but because of what it meant for her. This wasn't about ownership, it never had been. It was about something far more complicated, something rooted in a past he couldn't change and a future he was trying to reshape in the only way he knew how. "You think this fixes it?" she asked, her voice sharper now, the tension she had kept contained finally breaking through. "You think bringing me here, giving me all of this, makes up for what happened?" Daniel didn't respond right away, and in that silence Emily realized something she hadn't fully considered until that moment. This wasn't about redemption in the way she had imagined. It wasn't about balancing a scale or correcting a mistake with a single action. It was about control, not over her, but over an outcome he had once failed to influence. "It doesn't fix anything," he said finally, but it changes what comes next. That was the truth at the center of everything, the realization that brought clarity to every question she had asked since the beginning. Daniel Hayes hadn't brought her into his world to take something from her. He had done it because of what he had lost, because of a decision that had shaped him in ways he couldn't undo. And now he was trying to create something different, not just for her but for himself. The deal had never been about ownership, it had been about legacy. The truth didn't change everything overnight for Emily Carter, but it changed enough to alter the way she saw herself, and more importantly, the way she chose to move forward. For the first time since the day she left that small house in Kentucky, she wasn't reacting to a situation she didn't control. She was deciding what it meant. Daniel Hayes had given her access, resources, and a structure that forced her to grow, but what he hadn't given her was identity. That part had always been hers to define, and now she understood that more clearly than ever. The realization didn't come with relief. It came with responsibility, the kind that couldn't be handed off or ignored. Because if this was never about ownership, then staying, leaving, or reshaping everything around her became a choice she had to make for herself, not one that had already been made for her. She began to step into that choice deliberately, not with sudden defiance, not with emotional reaction, but with a level of control that mirrored the world she had been placed in. She expanded her education beyond what had been arranged, pushing into areas that gave her leverage, understanding how decisions were made at levels she had once thought were unreachable. She built connections not as someone dependent on Daniel Hayes, but as someone whose presence carried its own weight. And as she did, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. Daniel no longer observed her as someone he had brought into his world. He saw her as someone shaping it alongside him, someone who no longer needed the structure he had created to define her direction. There was a moment, subtle but undeniable, when that shift became complete. It didn't happen in a confrontation or a declaration. It happened in a decision. Emily chose to take control of something that extended beyond herself, an initiative that reflected everything she had learned, everything she had become since the day her life changed. It wasn't driven by obligation to Daniel or by the past that connected them. It was driven by her own understanding of what power could be used for and how it could change outcomes that once seemed fixed. And when she made that move, she didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for approval. She acted, fully aware of the weight of that choice and the direction it would set. Daniel didn't stop her. He didn't interfere. If anything, he stepped back in a way that made it clear the control he once held over the situation no longer applied in the same way. Their relationship, once defined by imbalance, had reached a point where it no longer fit into the roles it began with. Emily wasn't someone who had been brought into his life to be shaped. She was someone who had taken what was given, understood it, and transformed it into something entirely her own. And that's what made the final stage of her story different from anything anyone could have predicted. She didn't become powerful because someone handed it to her. She became powerful because she learned how to navigate a system that once seemed impossible to understand, and then chose to redefine her place within it. The idea of her becoming a princess was never about status in the traditional sense. It wasn't about wealth, appearance, or position granted by someone else. It was about control, independence, and the ability to stand in a world that once intimidated her and move through it with certainty. By the end, Emily Carter was no longer the girl standing silently in a doorway, waiting for someone else to decide her future. She was the one making decisions, influencing outcomes, and carrying a presence that no longer depended on where she came from or how her story began. And that transformation didn't erase the past. It didn't rewrite the choices that led her there, but it did something far more important. It proved that even in circumstances defined by loss of control, identity isn't something that can be taken. It's something that can be rebuilt, redefined, and ultimately claimed. By the time everything settled into place, the version of Emily Carter that had walked into Daniel Hayes' world no longer existed in any recognizable form. The transformation had been gradual, shaped by pressure, opportunity, and the constant need to redefine herself in a situation she never chose. But what made the final chapter of her story so difficult to fully understand was not what she gained. It was what she chose to leave behind. Because when the moment came when every advantage, every resource, and every position of influence was within her reach, Emily made a decision that neither her father nor Daniel Hayes had anticipated. She stepped away, not out of fear, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. The life she had built within that world no longer defined her, and staying would have meant allowing someone else's past to continue shaping her future. Daniel saw it before she said anything. He had spent enough time observing her to recognize the shift, the quiet certainty that replaced the questions she once carried. There was no confrontation this time, no need for explanation. When she told him she was leaving, he didn't argue, didn't try to persuade her to stay. And in that moment, it became clear that whatever control he once believed he had over the outcome no longer existed. Emily wasn't rejecting what he had given her. She was redefining it. She had taken everything that environment offered, learned from it, grown within it, and then made the choice to move beyond it entirely. What she built afterward didn't carry his name or his influence in the way people might expect. It reflected her own understanding of power, one shaped not by wealth alone but by experience, by the knowledge of what it means to lose control and take it back. She didn't become a princess in the way the story might suggest. She redefined what that meant. Not someone elevated by circumstance, but someone who understood her own value without needing it confirmed by anyone else. And in doing so, she stepped into a position that neither her past nor Daniel Hayes's intentions could fully contain. In the end, he didn't make her a princess. He gave her the chance to become something far more dangerous, someone who no longer needed saving. What would you have done if you were in Emily Carter's position, standing in that doorway with no control over the decision being made for you, knowing that one moment could define the rest of your life? Would you have fought against it, even if it meant risking everything your family had left? Or would you have done what she did and stepped forward into something you didn't fully understand, hoping that somewhere along the way you could take back control? And what about her father, a man who believed he had run out of options, who convinced himself that this was the only way to protect what remained of his family? Was he justified in making that choice, or did he cross a line that can never truly be forgiven, no matter how much pressure he was under at the time? And then there's Daniel Hayes, a man whose actions were shaped by past he could not change, who tried to create something different out of a decision that many would never accept. Was he offering opportunity, or was he simply rewriting his own story through someone else's life? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers, which is what makes stories like this stay with us long after they end. Let me know what you think in the comments, because your perspective might see something others don't. And if you want more real stories like this, stories that challenge how we think about choice, power, and consequence, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.